On February 6, 2014, a crew of American explorers from Maine decided to venture into Norway for an underwater cave dive through a place called Plura Cave. They didn't realize that their trip would quickly turn into one of the most terrifying cave accidents in the country's recent history. And what made this tragedy even more heartbreaking was that one of the divers, a 46-year-old named Mike Johnson, was no stranger to the risks of cave diving. He'd seen its dangers firsthand many times before. About a year earlier, Mike had already lost his best friend and longtime diving buddy, David, during a training session in an old quarry in northern Michigan. Still, just a few months after that, he was already gearing up for another dive into one of Europe's most dangerous underwater caves. This time he was accompanied by four top-tier divers: 42-year-old Chris Baker, 40-year-old Ethan Brooks, 34-year-old Caleb Stevens, and the youngest, 33-year-old Ryan Mitchell. Their plan was straightforward in theory: approach through the submerged entrance in the Plura River and exit through a different point. But it wasn't going to be easy because Plura is known to be the deepest cave in northern Europe. Plus, the connection between the two entrances was only recently found, so detailed maps or experience navigating it were virtually non-existent. This newly discovered route plunged down over 130 meters into pitch-black, icy waters, with freezing temperatures and narrow squeezes that made the route even more formidable. Even if everything went perfectly, the entire dive was expected to last around 5 hours. In conditions this harsh and unpredictable, making a mistake was almost certain to be fatal, since there was hardly any room for error. Any small deviation from the plan, a gear malfunction, or even a tiny tear in a dry suit could lead to a slow, agonizing death in the freezing depths. With all those dangers in mind, the team arrived at the ice-covered start point on February 6th, cut a triangular hole in the ice, and prepared for the dive. Instead of going in all at once, they split into two groups. Chris and Ethan went first, using underwater scooters to conserve their strength, while Ryan, Mike, Caleb, and David waited a couple of hours to let the sediment settle, improving their visibility when they entered. Visibility was a critical concern because sunlight barely penetrated the water past a few meters, and any loss could be deadly. Thankfully, things started off okay. After descending 34 meters over approximately 500 meters, the divers reached a partially flooded chamber filled with air that stretched over 250 meters. It provided a brief rest spot before they faced the steep, difficult climb ahead. Surprisingly, they encountered little resistance on their way to the deepest point of Plura Cave, so they briefly believed the whole operation might go smoothly, a rare moment of hope in such treacherous circumstances. But that hope was short-lived. They soon reached a narrow, sharply curved section of the cave so tight that even a fully suited diver could barely squeeze through. At that point, moving forward was their only option since turning back was impossible. Chris volunteered to go first while Ryan was trying to prepare for the tight turn. Suddenly, Ryan's flashlight flickered and snuffed out, then started flashing rapidly. When Chris turned to see what was going on, he saw Ryan frantically signaling for help. One of Ryan's bailout cylinders had become entangled in the environment around them, trapping him in place. Panic was setting in at this depth, a deadly situation. Chris tried to calm Ryan down, but in such a confined space, there wasn't much he could do. The narrow gap made it easy to rupture suits or damage gear with just one wrong move. So, Chris focused on what had to be done. He let go of his scooter, swam backwards carefully, and shifted Ryan's bailout cylinder a few meters to set him free. But when Chris swam back around to check on Ryan, things got worse. Ryan's regulator had somehow come out of his mouth, and before Chris could reach him, Ryan inhaled water, ending his life in an instant. Watching his friend's body float in front of him, Chris was filled with a mix of shock and grief, but he knew he had to stay calm or risk following Ryan into the depths. He checked his dive computer, praying for guidance, only to see a shocking new number: 400 minutes, a huge jump from the 120-minute limit earlier. The dive that was supposed to take 5 hours was now creeping toward 9, and staying longer would mean risking a deadly decompression sickness. With no choice, Chris turned away from Ryan's body and started swimming toward the second entrance, leaving the tragedy behind. Meanwhile, the second team of 3 divers was making their way in, unaware of the disaster that had just unfolded. Following the original plan, they started 2 hours after Chris and Ethan set out. As they reached the deepest parts, Vesa, one of the divers, suddenly heard a distress call from someone's equipment. Fear crept into him, and what he saw was even worse. Dead ahead was Yari, lying motionless, his body blocking the narrow passage. It was too horrific to look at, but the passage was too tight to turn back. If they wanted to continue, they had no choice but to face it head-on. Vesa hesitated, but knew turning around meant staying underwater for up to 12 hours, with no guarantee their oxygen would hold out. Yari Yu, the next diver behind Vesa, faced the same nightmare. But panic overwhelmed him almost immediately. His breathing grew erratic, and he lost his composure entirely, which proved fatal. Kai, the last diver on the team, tried to calm Yari Yu, but it was no use. Panic took over and he drowned too. Kai, seeing his friends die, decided to retreat alone, convinced Vesa was destined for the same fate. Miraculously, Vesa managed to squeeze through just moments after Kai turned back, and 3 divers were left swimming separately, each thinking he was the only survivor. Patrick and Vesa headed toward a dry chamber they called the Stein Ula Flag, while Kai slowly retraced his steps toward the original entrance. After nearly 9 hours underwater, Patrick was the first to reach the surface around 9 p.m., with Vesa surfacing an hour later. On the other side, Kai broke through the thin ice covering the ponds opening around 1:30 a.m., dragging himself into the van where they'd all started. He didn't know if Chris or Vesa had survived, but he clung to hope, waiting for them. To his relief, they arrived around 2 a.m., concluding their horrific ordeal in the depths of that dangerous cave. But that terrifying cave, Plura, wasn't the only one testing human endurance. Just 4 years later, another catastrophe struck in a place called Verevkina Cave. Deep in the mountains of Abkhazia, the cave plunges over 22 meters into the earth, less traveled, less understood, and even more deadly. By September 2018, a Russian team led by Pavel Domatov decided to take on this challenge again. They had already succeeded months prior, having reached and mapped its deepest point, but this time they brought 2 new members, British cave photographer Robbie Shawn and his assistant Jeff Wade. Their goals were ambitious: photograph the surreal underground terrain, gather samples of newly discovered creatures like tiny shrimp and scorpions, and study how life survives in complete darkness. The preparation was intense. Each diver carried over 66 pounds of gear, bundled in heavy thermal clothing because the cave's temperature was near freezing. The descent was brutal from the start. They had to rappel down a narrow 32-meter shaft, which was only the beginning. From there, they faced thousands of meters of twisted, tight tunnels. Reaching just the first camp 600 meters down took about 8 hours. That was their first rest stop during what would become a multi-day expedition, since the cave's depth requires multiple underground camps for rest, drying out, and planning the next stretch. They set up 6 camps before reaching the deepest point, where they planned to spend over a week exploring and documenting the stunning turquoise lake at the end of the caves, and collecting samples of the tiny creatures living in the darkness. Initially, their plans went smoothly. For 6 days, they explored, took photos, and made scientific notes, but that all came to a grinding halt on day 7. 2 team members, Roman and Natalia, had just left to catch a flight when catastrophe struck. A deafening roar and a flood of water suddenly poured into the cave, drowning the entire chamber without warning. They immediately tried to contact the team still at the bottom via the communication line, but Robbie and the others dismissed it. Floods like this weren't uncommon and usually passed quickly. They assumed it was just another passing pulse of water and kept working, but they were dead wrong. Moments later, water burst from a nearby chasm and began flooding their camp. Realizing they were in serious trouble, Robbie sprang into action. He quickly suited up, clipped himself to the safety rope, and started climbing up. But the route was filling with water, making every movement exhausting and dangerous. The pressure was immense, and every breath became a struggle. Still, Robbie kept going, knowing that everyone behind him depended on his lead. Hours dragged on, but eventually he reached a relatively dry section of the tunnel where the water had diverted away. He found an anchor point and finally got a brief rest. Wade joined him shortly after, and they exchanged worried glances, unsure whether the rest of the team had made it out safely. The water was still rising. They continued their ascent through the freezing water for several stressful hours and finally emerged at a depth of about 19 meters. Then, in the distance, they saw flickering headlamps the other team. It was a miracle. The 5 divers who had left days earlier had all managed to escape just in time. They climbed out just as the floodwaters receded enough for them to reach land. After 4 more days of trekking and climbing, they finally made it back to safety, battered but alive. They'd survived what could have been a final resting place for them, a cave deep, dark, and lethal beyond measure. But while their ordeal was physical and visible, some stories of caves turn more to the mysterious and supernatural. Take the story of Ted, a man from New York who, in 2001, started blogging about his strange and terrifying cave experiences. His first entry, written in March 2001, described an expedition in December 2000 with a buddy he called B. They had gone deep into an obscure cave, discovering a small chamber accessible only by crawling through narrow passages and climbing over ledges, where they found a tiny hole with an eerie, steady wind blowing out. Ted was intrigued. He believed there was an unexplored chamber just beyond that hole, something no human had ever seen. The idea of opening that hole to see what was on the other side filled him with excitement. So they returned the following month with tools to make it bigger. It was slow work, taking 2 days just to widen the opening a few inches because the space was too tight for more than one person to work comfortably. As they chipped away at the rock, strange sounds started to appear. The howling grew louder, and then they noticed a deep rumbling noise that hadn't been there before, sounds they initially dismissed as trucks passing on a distant road. But they knew better because the cave's location was remote and no traffic was nearby. On February 10th, they took their dog with them, hoping to explore the tunnel further. The dog immediately became anxious and refused to approach the hole. Despite attempts to coax her inside, they decided to widen the opening enough to crawl through. B was drilling nearby when he heard a grinding noise deep within the tunnel, a strange, rhythmic scraping that unsettled him. They managed to make the opening just big enough for Ted to squeeze through on their next visit. Getting through was an ordeal. Ted could only inch forward with his arms pinned to his sides, but he pressed on, eager to uncover what lay beyond. What they found was even more disturbing. The chamber opened into a surprisingly large room where a strange, perfectly round stone dominated the scene. It was unnatural, like something crafted rather than formed by nature. Near it, they discovered strange hieroglyphic-like markings on the wall, depicting a group of figures surrounding an odd symbol. Ted was overwhelmed with questions. What was this bizarre place? Why did it exist? They decided to bring a friend named Joe back to investigate, but when they tried to enter this mysterious chamber, Ted hit his head, got a concussion, and was knocked out. Joe went alone and didn't come back for hours. When he finally emerged, he was pale, trembling, and unresponsive, muttering only that he didn't feel well. After that day, Joe refused to talk to them again, leaving Ted and B baffled and desperate for answers. So they went back again, this time with proper equipment, a cable phone and a camera to document everything. Ted entered alone and reached the chamber again. As he examined the surroundings, a grinding noise echoed from behind him. Startled, he knocked his helmet against the ceiling, smashing his flashlight. He fumbled for glow sticks, and when he finally cracked one open, the room was empty. He tried to call out on the phone, no response. The line was dead. Then he saw something even stranger. The large, unnatural stone had shifted position, now sitting atop the phone wire, probably cutting off the connection. His heart pounding, Ted felt a sinister presence behind him. He couldn't look back, he just had to run. As he crawled through the narrow tunnel, a thick, wet stench filled the air, suffocating him. Bursting out of the hole, he gasped, trying to catch his breath. But before he could process what was happening, he heard scraping sounds echoing from inside again. Panic set in, and he and B bolted for the exit. They scrambled up the rope, which suddenly jerked back as if something was pulling it down from above. Both managed to reach the top just in time, cutting the rope free because they knew whatever was down there wasn't done with them. Weeks later, Ted posted a note on his blog. "To my family and friends reading this, be at peace. I will conquer this cave. I will return and I will update you all. Love, Ted." That was the last anyone heard from him online. His story spread rapidly, sparking wild theories about what had happened. Some even suggested supernatural creatures or portals leading to other worlds. But the truth was much stranger and simpler. A YouTube interview with Ted himself later revealed that most of his tales were fabricated, a horror story crafted to captivate and terrify. Whether real or not, his experience remains one of the most unforgettable and eerie cave stories to ever circulate on the web.